On the night of December 20th, 1939, Hans Wilhelm Langsdorff, Kapitän zur See and commander of Panzerschiff Admiral Graf Spee, retired to his room in the Naval Hotel in Buenos Aires and wrote his final letter. I can now only prove by my death that the fighting forces of the Third Reich are ready to die for the honor of the flag. I alone bear the responsibility for the scuttling of Admiral Graf Spee. I am happy to pay with my life for any possible repercussions on the honor of the flag. I shall face my fate with firm faith in the cause, in the future of the nation, and in my Führer. Hans Langsdorff had taken command of Admiral Graf Spee in October 1938 and later was, of course, responsible for her destruction by scuttling. But before we talk about Graf Spee's combat career and eventual destruction, it's probably worth mentioning a few words about the history of the ship itself. To do this, a quick trip down history lane. 1919, the Treaty of Versailles is signed, and it's effectively Germany's surrender on paper. With it came the virtual elimination of the German Navy and a whole series of restrictions and limitations as to the design of any future warships, particularly by displacement and gun caliber. As a result, the German ship designers in the 1920s and 30s were presented with a rather daunting task. Whilst remaining within the limitations of the treaty, how would they build viable fighting ships? And to do this, they decided to create a class of ships that were powerful enough to outgun any cruiser that could catch it and fast enough to outrun any battleship. They achieved quite good success. The result was the Panzerschiff, the armoured ship, the first of which was the Deutschland of 1933. It had guns approaching that of a battleship, and it did have the speed of a cruiser. The third and the most advanced of these Deutschland-class ships was Admiral Graf Spee. Now, these ships didn't fit into the conventional international standards of classification, and eventually the British press came up with the term pocket battleship, by which the ships will be commonly known afterwards. Once she commissioned into the fleet, January 6, 1936, she became the flagship and partook in a number of fleet reviews by Adolf Hitler and was sent on a number of goodwill missions to foreign nations. But long before the invasion of Poland, the Kriegsmarine leadership had developed plans for commerce raiding in the Atlantic Ocean, and in these plans the pocket battleships were to play a leading role. In the plans personally approved by Hitler, Admiral Spee was to depart and meet up with the supply ship Altmark in the Atlantic, and then, upon receipt of a special signal, would engage in commerce warfare against an unspecified enemy, but the common understanding was that these ships would be British. On the 21st of August 1939, Graf Spee departed Wilhelmshaven, bound for the South Atlantic. Bad weather helped her go undetected, first along the coast of Norway and then off the south coast of Iceland. She did get a bit of a lucky break. On September the 6th, 5 days after the war started, British cruisers set up picket positions along the route, but it was too late. By then, the German ship had already broken through and was sailing slowly towards the equator. For most of the first month of the war, Langsdorff had received no orders from Berlin and maintained radio watch in silence. She paced slowly around the equator, and the sailors built a dummy second turret out of canvas and plywood to help conceal itself and confuse enemy targets, although it did also have the effect of perchance confusing the enemy and eventually even their own side. On the 25th of September, the ship finally received orders authorizing attacks on Allied merchant shipping. 5 days later, Graf Spee's Arado spotter aircraft located the British cargo ship Clement. It almost turned out to be something of a bumpy start. The cargo ship started to evade them whilst transmitting an RRR signal, which meant under attack by a raider, before the German cruiser finally convinced her to stop. Admiral Spee took captain and chief engineer prisoner, but let the rest of her crew abandon ship in the lifeboats. Clement put up a fight going down though. The flood valves were opened and scuttling charges were placed, but the steamer just wasn't about to sink. It took 30 rounds of 15 centimeter and 2 torpedoes for the British vessel to finally break up and start going down. During the following month, the pocket battleship sank 4 more British ships, taking their crew members and capturing cargoes. A valuable prize was the standard issue British radio, which was then put in Admiral Spee's wheelhouse. as well as documents to better interpret the radio communications which were being transmitted. Now Langsdorff had the ability to listen in on the British. All of these operations were happily described as piracy by the British, although the Panzerschiff commander, wanting to be a gentleman, tried to strictly adhere to prize rules and to ensure that the crews were safely evacuated, sending distress signals to ensure their rescue, and they treated the senior captured personnel with respect. The Allies learned of the enemy raids in the Atlantic by early October. London was quick to react. 3 British hunter groups were formed to track down Admiral Spee. 4 heavy cruisers, 1 battle cruiser, and 1 aircraft carrier. The forces put out by the British was impressive, but first they had to find the Nazi raider. The first such opportunity presented itself when the steamer Newton Beach managed to transmit an under-attack radio signal. Had the signal reached the powerful Freetown station, the focal node for the raider hunters in the South Atlantic, the aircraft which had been dispatched to search for the raider in good conditions would have easily found her. Admiral Spee would have had little chance against the forces of His Majesty's battlecruiser Renown and heavy cruiser Cumberland. On another occasion, the German ship almost lost her supply vessel. Altmark was spotted accidentally by aircraft from the carrier Ark Royal. Upon receiving an identification request, Altmark boldly responded, "We are the American transport Del Mar." The British did not double-check this, and Altmark made a rather lucky escape. Having analysed the situation and radio intercepts warning about predatory Nazi ships, Langsdorff decided to stop pestering the British for a little while. On the 14th of October, Admiral Spee rendezvoused with Altmark to refuel and transfer her prisoners and prizes. Then they parted ways. Altmark went to more deserted areas of the South Atlantic, and Spee sailed first west and then southeast to the Indian Ocean, south of Madagascar and around the Cape of Good Hope. The purpose of that foray was to divert the Allied warships away from the South Atlantic and to confuse the Allies about his intentions. Langsdorff chose the waters south of Madagascar as his next area of operations. These waters offered something to plunder: the commercial lanes leading to the Suez Canal or the Atlantic Ocean Gateway. Plus, now the search zone for the British spanned an entire ocean, whilst Admiral Spee could quickly return to the Atlantic. However, pickings were slim in this new hunting ground. In 2 weeks, the raider managed to capture and sink just 1 ship. At the same time, the weather began to deteriorate. The result of all this was that on November the 9th, 1939, the ship's Arado 196 broke down and could not be repaired, depriving Graf Spee of her aerial reconnaissance, which would eventually prove to be a fatal factor. Seeing that the ship was down on luck in her new location, Captain Langsdorff decided to return to the Atlantic. On the 20th of November, Graf Spee went back around the southern tip of Africa, and after 6 days rendezvoused again with her trusted sidekick, the escort vessel Altmark. By this time, Admiral Spee had been cruising around for almost 3 months and needed an engine overhaul as well as to have her hull scraped. She also needed to be refueled and have her supplies replenished. After taking several days for these necessities, on December the 2nd, Admiral Graf Spee stopped a large turbine steamer, Doric Star, carrying a valuable cargo of grain, wool, and frozen meat. Langsdorff gave the order to immediately sink the vessel, salvaging only 19 silver bars. He acted quickly, as the British could have been let in on the raider's location by the merchant's distress signal. The next day, Graf Spee sent another English steamer to the bottom, costing Britain 2 ships in the same area within 24 hours. On the morning of December the 6th, Admiral Spee once again, and now as we know for the last time, replenished her supplies and refueled from Altmark, before capturing another British ship in the evening, which was then sunk after they had disembarked the crew. In one of the newspapers that they captured, the German commander and his officers found a photograph of the heavy cruiser Cumberland, wearing camouflage. This photograph prompted them to further modify their concealment and their camouflage stunt. They decided that they were going to paint the ship the same way, build a dummy second funnel behind the aircraft catapult, and also modified the paint on her mast to look like a tripod. This is all to further alter her silhouette to resemble the British ship. Following this, the captain of the pocket battleship decided once again to relocate to a different area. This time, Langsdorff decided to head for the River Plate. Overlooking it was Buenos Aires, with up to 60 British ships coming out that way every month, and this seemed like a rather irresistible jackpot to the Germans. Meanwhile, the Admiralty was getting seriously aggravated by the raiders and their own failure to catch them. First, the British ships had tried to track down the enemy by using distress signals of the attacked ships, but Hitler's raiders knew to immediately leave the area of their attacks, and they thus remained invisible to the British. Commodore Henry Harwood, who was in charge of the cruiser squadron, one of the British groups in the Atlantic that covered the Southern American waters, tried instead to anticipate the next move of his opposition. He took to the seas off Montevideo and Buenos Aires, which he had figured was going to be Langsdorff's next target. On December the 9th, heavy cruiser HMS Exeter, which had just undergone maintenance, was hastily recalled from its base in the Falkland Islands. 2 days later, on the morning of December the 12th, she rendezvoused with Ajax and Achilles, two Leander-class light cruisers. In the evening, the ships practiced closing in on an enemy and closing to enough distance that the 6-inch guns could be effective. This was the MO that Harwood had suggested for tackling pocket battleships. Then the Royal Navy squadron moved along the Uruguayan coast to the River Plate. Admiral Graf Spee, the pocket battleship and bane of merchant shipping in the South Atlantic, was going in the same direction almost flat out. The German ship was, remember, travelling blind. Her errata floatplane was again beyond repair. Early in the morning of the 13th of December 1939, lookouts spotted a pair of masts off the German ship's starboard bow. The raider quickly identified the ship as Exeter. She was accompanied apparently by a pair of smaller warships, which were initially mistaken for destroyers. The weather was perfect, with calm seas and almost perfect visibility. Captains would say Langsdorff decided to bring his ship to battle readiness and to close the distance at maximum speed. His panzer ship had full tanks and ammunition racks, and the presence of destroyers usually meant a convoy. Spee's raiding sortie was coming to an end, and the commander hoped to go out with a bang. The commander of the pocket battleship was not intimidated by the British cruiser, and he figured he could easily evade any torpedoes launched from destroyers. Langsdorff was known to be a torpedo specialist. Furthermore, getting rid of 3 fast pursuers required forcing them into a decisive battle. With the German vessel closing in on them at full tilt, the British soon spotted their opponent. Upon identifying Graf Spee, Harwood divided his forces up to split the enemy's fire. Ajax and Achilles would attack Graf Spee from one side and heavy cruiser Exeter from the other. It was a brave move by the British commander, and a rather risky one that almost cost him his good fortune. In turn, by the time the Germans had identified the Leander-class cruisers, it was too late for them to retreat. Their opponents had already gotten too close. Noticing the separation of the enemy ships, Langsdorff decided to destroy the primary enemy threat first. At 0618, the German ship opened fire with a main battery at Exeter. After a couple of minutes, the British returned fire and the battle was on. The Battle of the River Plate, 13th December 1939, was the first classic artillery duel between large surface ships of the Second World War. The Germans were the first to get steel on target, with the third volley of the pocket battleship's 11-inch guns striking Exeter. The fragmentation wiped out the starboard torpedo crew and riddled the aircraft sitting on the catapult, as well as the entire side and superstructure from the waterline to the top of the funnels. Spotlights were broken and major fires started. The gun's readiness reporting system was disabled, meaning that the senior gunner effectively had to fire on faith, not knowing for sure whether or not all of his guns were ready to send a complete volley. Then a 283mm high explosive shell hit the super-firing 8-inch turret and detonated. The explosive concussion rendered the turret useless and killed or badly wounded all of the men on the bridge, excepting the captain. Communication tubes, pipes and cables leading from the director and rangefinders to the fire center were also severed. The cruiser lost her navigational aids and wouldn't answer the helm. Thus, the ship had lost a third of her artillery and her overall combat power was seriously reduced. The float plane obviously could not help with adjustments to firing, and orders to the steering compartment and engines had to be relayed via a chain of sailors. The next German main battery salvo knocked out the remaining forward turret and destroyed the radio room, killing 5 radio operators and damaging the right forward 4-inch gun, killing the gun crew. The pocket battleship's main 28cm battery was undeniably proving its worth against cruisers. However, the British were quick to return the favour. German officers from Graf Spee would later characterise the return fire from Exeter as rapid and accurate. One 8-inch shell went through a tower-like superstructure without exploding. Another carved up the top of a 100mm belt and a 40mm longitudinal bulkhead to then explode. It caused serious damage to the cables with its fragmentation and started a fire that engulfed the storage compartment of dry chemical extinguishing agent. Those sailors that fought the fire received severe burns and also poisoning from the fumes. Still, had the projectile hit maybe a meter lower and exploded in the engine room, the consequences for Graf Spee would have been quite severe. However, with every passing minute, the fire from Exeter was becoming less and less effective. She was seriously damaged, 1 meter down by the bow when listing, with her speed having dropped to 17 knots. Although the turbines and boilers remained intact, she was in a bit of a tight spot. In just 20 minutes of battle, the German radar had basically rendered the heavy cruiser worthless. Exeter still managed to unleash a torpedo salvo, but the Germans didn't even take notice while she was maneuvering. Meanwhile, Admiral Spee was getting pretty roughed up by the fire from the light cruisers, with several of the semi-armor piercing shells hitting one of the ship's superstructures and shrapnel hitting Langsdorff in the shoulder and hand. Until then, he was rather imperturbably commanding the ship from its open bridge with his iconic smoking pipe in his hands. But the blast wave threw the commander of the raider onto the floor and knocked him out. The senior officer was thus forced to temporarily take over. The wounds weren't serious, but it is considered that the concussion may have influenced the captain's formerly relentless confidence. At least that's what the senior officers would say later. Exeter stopped firing at 0730. Water was flooding in and the near miss from another 28cm shell had short-circuited the electrical system for her remaining turret. With Exeter breaking off, the combined fire of Ajax and Achilles thus drew Langsdorff's attention as both ships closed in on the German. 15 minutes into the battle, they were separated by a distance of about 12 kilometers. Graf Spee sent 3 salvos at Ajax's direction, but the British started maneuvering and each time changed course towards the direction of the fall of shot from the enemy's volley. The evasion method is known as hunting for salvos, and it produced effective results. The light cruiser did not get hit. Achilles, however, was less fortunate. A 283mm projectile exploded just short of her side, with the fragmentation reaching her bridge and control tower, killing 4 sailors and wounding 3 more, including a gunnery officer. Meanwhile, Langsdorff hauled the raider around from an easterly course and positioned behind Ajax and Achilles towards the northwest in an attempt to prevent torpedoes from being launched at her. This was also to break away from the light cruisers and their rapid-firing 6-inch guns, which seemed effective at close quarters. Noticing that Spee was turning, Harwood decided to follow her. Although the maneuver temporarily rendered half of its artillery useless, the gap from the enemy opened up to 16 kilometers, meaning that both parties were losing accuracy. The British light cruisers finished their wide turn and both started catching up to Graf Spee at a speed of 31 knots. Harwood ordered a 30-degree turn to port in order to enable them to bring all of their remaining guns to bear, but Langsdorff employed the same method of hunting for shells and also laid smoke, thus avoiding being hit. Exeter showed up from the south for the last time, drawing off the Germans' main battery fire, but these constant changes of target and maneuvers undermined the German accuracy, and none of the German projectiles scored a hit. By that time, the 6-inch shells from the light cruisers had started dealing notable damage to Graf Spee. One of them broke through the 150mm starboard gun, wiping out the crew and disabling the weapon. Several hits were also scored in the tower-like superstructure, and one exploded under the topmost fire control position, killing 2 sailors and mortally wounding Lieutenant Grigget, the only German officer to become a fatality in the Battle of the River Plate. The next hit knocked out the feeding mechanism of the 15cm bow gun, taking it out of the battle and disrupting communications with the director and the rangefinder post on the bow superstructure. This had a significant impact on the German raider. The rangefinder crew did not hear the order to change fire to a different light cruiser and continued reporting distance to Ajax, thus compromising all of the fire adjustment on Graf Spee. She was constantly maneuvering and laying smoke screens, and the distance between the pursuers and their foe was now down to just 7 kilometers. The British cruisers were taking a much more direct course. But by that time, the confusion with aiming the battery of the main guns from Graf Spee had been dealt with, and the fire of the pocket battleship became accurate again. Ajax was hit by a 28cm shell that put one turret out of action and jammed another, causing also some casualties in the process. Then a blast from another salvo destroyed her mast and caused even more casualties. After an exchange of accurate hits, the British and German commanders almost simultaneously concluded that it was time to stop the battle for a bit. Henry Harwood aboard Ajax only had 3 working guns remaining, and they were down to 20% of their ammunition reserves. Achilles was more combat effective, but the commander knew that the enemy's showing stern made her nigh on invulnerable to torpedoes. In view of the above situation, and also understanding that the German ship still seemed to be doing a good pace and was apparently firing accurately, he felt that the odds of success were not in his favor. At the same time, Langsdorff was receiving reports from his positions that their ammunition was depleted to almost 70%, and that their speed had reduced to about 22 knots due to flooding caused by all of the shells and fragmentation. All of these factors did not inspire much optimism in the German commander, so he also decided to break off from the battle. Under the cover of the British smokescreen, all participants began to quickly disperse. The observing pilot of the British aircraft recalled that it looked like a choreographed move. As if on cue, all the ships turned around and started moving away from each other. The battle lasted a total of 1 hour and 24 minutes. In terms of the raw figures, the Battle of the River Plate was a victory for the pocket battleship. 2 hits by 203mm and 18 by 152mm shells hadn't caused any fatal damage, and the flooding reduced her speed of travel, but she was not trimming or listing, and the power system seemed to be in perfect order. Yes, her light battery was somewhat damaged. Only one of the 105mm guns was still battle-worthy, but Spee's main battery remained fully operational. Despite 3 direct 6-inch hits, the thick armor had held up and the guns had never stopped firing. Out of almost 1,200 men, 1 officer and 35 ratings were killed, and 58 were wounded or poisoned, most of them only lightly. The British were much worse off. Exeter was basically rendered unseaworthy, despite having lost only 5 officers and 56 sailors. A further 11 were killed on the light cruisers. By the end of the battle, the firepower that Harwood had at his disposal was almost half. Barely 360 rounds remained aboard the more capable Achilles, and only 10 torpedoes were left between the 2 ships. But Harwood was not going to just let the pocket battleship escape. 10 minutes after the end of the major fighting, a pursuit ensued, Ajax keeping to the Germans' port and Achilles to the starboard. Graf Spee now seemed to be escorted by the light cruisers, which kept themselves at a moderate distance. So what to do next? Langsdorff's options were not numerous. He could wait until nightfall and maybe try to break away from his pursuers under the cover of darkness, or he could head to a neutral port, patch up, and after breaking out, disappear into the open ocean. The commander of Graf Spee clearly did not want a night battle though. With limited visibility, he would have to fight at a shorter range, and this could have tipped the battle. The gunnery would have been effective for both sides. Furthermore, trying to escape in the dark without a fight greatly increased the likelihood of catching a couple of torpedo salvos, which would surely send the ship under. To a neutral port it was then, but Rio de Janeiro was too far away, and Buenos Aires, where the German influence was quite strong and the government would perhaps be more welcoming, was accessible only via a narrow and shallow route, which came with the risk of running aground and maybe getting torpedoed, or just simply clogging up the pump filters and rendering the ship unseaworthy. Of course, we can only guess at what was going through Wilhelm Langsdorff's mind when he was deciding where to seek refuge. He didn't comment upon his order, and he didn't leave any records about the choice. But we do know that, as a historic fact, the German heavy cruiser Admiral Graf Spee headed for the capital of Uruguay, Montevideo. This decision, as we now know, sealed the fate of the ship and of her commander. Shortly after midnight that night, the German ship anchored in the roadstead of the Uruguayan capital, and Harwood's cruisers took up positions guarding the two likely exits from Montevideo. And so we enter the realm of politics and diplomacy. Langsdorff initially asked the Uruguayan government for 2 weeks to make repairs. Officially, this was necessary to fix the hull and propulsion. Unofficially, it was also to allow time to pull up several submarines into the River Plate estuary, which will then help lift the blockade. However, the British, perfectly aware of the situation, were somewhat more adept at diplomatic shenanigans. The British consul in Montevideo had great influence in Uruguay, and the foreign minister of the country was a good friend of his. In addition, 8 British merchant ships were in the harbour of Montevideo, and one of them was as close as 300 meters to the battleship, which was immediately used for surveillance of the German vessel. At the same time, efforts were made by the British to feed false intelligence to the Germans that an overwhelming British force was being assembled in Buenos Aires, implying that the aircraft carrier Ark Royal and battlecruiser Renown were on their way. Furthermore, Harwood received reinforcement just in time. The heavy cruiser Cumberland had just arrived from the Falkland Islands, and this was rather fatally mistaken by one of the German officers to be the battlecruiser Renown. Fear, some say, makes the wolf bigger than he is, and the two ships bear basically no resemblance to one another at all. But the news of the arrival of the battlecruiser left the Germans without any hope of escape. Believing the British reports, Langsdorff discussed his options with Kriegsmarine commanders in Berlin. Basically, the options were to either break out and seek refuge in Buenos Aires, where the Argentine government would probably intern the ship, or to simply scuttle the ship in the Plate estuary. Perhaps surprisingly, a breakthrough attempt or perhaps uneven battle was not considered an option. After a discussion between Fleet Commander Admiral Raeder and Hitler himself, it was decided to scuttle the ship. Langsdorff received his orders on the evening of December the 16th. The next day, he ordered the destruction of all important equipment aboard the ship. The fire control systems were destroyed with hammers and hand grenades. The ship's remaining ammunition was dispersed throughout the ship in preparation for scuttling. About 1800, on December 17, 1939, all flags flying, heavy cruiser Admiral Graf Spee moved to the outer roadstead 4 miles off the coast and prepared for scuttling. Charges were set, and the crew were taken off by an Argentine tug. The ship was then scuttled. Multiple explosions from the ammunition sent jets of flame high into the sky, with large clouds of smoke obscuring the sight and the ship that was burning beneath for 3 days. Of the crew of the Raider, all 1,100 people or so basically, barring those that were buried in Uruguay or injured in hospitals in Montevideo, they were arrived safely to the capital of Argentina. The rather permissive attitude of the Argentine authorities allowed many sailors and officers to get back to Germany in different and perhaps somewhat difficult ways, where they could then take part in further hostilities. A notable example was the chief gunnery officer of the battleship, Paul Asher, who proved his worth in the Battle of the River Plate, and upon his return to Germany was assigned a similar post aboard Bismarck. Thus it was his shells that sank the battlecruiser Hood, although only 3 days later Asher was then killed along with his new ship. Finally, a few words on Captain Langsdorff. That night of December the 20th, 1939, after he finished penning his letter, Kapitänsersee Hans Wilhelm Langsdorff, the commander of the Panzership Admiral Graf Spee, shot himself in full dress uniform lying on the ship's battle ensign in his hotel room in the Naval Hotel of Buenos Aires, and thereby preventing any accusations of cowardice. The wreck of Admiral Graf Spee rested in shallow water, with much of the ship's burnt superstructure remaining above the water level. Salvage rights were purchased from the German government by the British through a couple of shell companies, who had been surprised by the accuracy of the gunnery and expected to find a radar rangefinder, which indeed they did. They also salvaged weapon samples, 105mm anti-aircraft guns and machine guns. The remaining wreck was gradually broken up in situ. And there perhaps is the final irony. The famous German Vice Admiral Count Maximilian von Spee was killed leading his cruiser squadron at the Battle of the Falkland Islands. And his namesake ship was sunk as a result of cruisers from those same Falkland Islands, sinking 11,500 kilometers from the fatherland.